Hello, my name is Crystal Petry, and you are watching another episode of the Crystal Petry Podcast, Season 3. Today's episode is a courageous and necessary conversation about uncovering uncomfortable truths. My guest, a beautiful white woman, shares what it's meant to discover through a book written by someone in her own family that her ancestors were colonizers and slave owners in Mississippi. This is a raw discussion about truth, responsibility, identity, and what to do after we learn the history we were never meant to question. Welcome to the podcast, Hilary. How are you?
Oh, thank you, Crystal. I'm well. I'm so glad to be with you today and have this conversation.
Absolutely. It is this conversation, I feel, and I've been thinking about this conversation, obviously, I feel like it is going to be an uncomfortable truth conversation.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely.
Yes.
Yeah, I remember when I first uncovered this information, I was so uncomfortable I could barely even speak about it. But now I have, worked with it so much that I'm actually really okay talking about it. So thank
Good.
you for enabling that to happen.
Mhm. So, Hillary, tell us, how did you first discover that you had family members that were colonizers and slave owners?
Well, it was almost exactly 10 years ago. It was on New Year's Eve of 2015.
Mm-hmm.
And I had started to become curious about my ancestors, and I was visiting my parents and asking my mom questions about the family. And she pulled this book out of the closet that had been there for decades. And I took it to my room and started to read it. And that late that night on New Year's Eve, I realized that I had ancestors who had migrated from the Scottish Highlands to North Carolina in 1739. And then from there, the grandson of that first generation walked down to Mississippi, where he received a land grant and he enslaved people. And he and his descendants enslaved people for several generations. And so that was how I found out. And in hindsight, I totally should have known, because this is the history of many white Americans.
Okay.
These are our family histories. But there's something about whiteness and white supremacy that enables us to be in denial about this, and for it to be forgotten and swept under the rug, and we pretend it didn't happen, or we pretend it happened in other families and not our own. And so at first I felt like this huge weight of responsibility, like, oh my gosh, this is my people who did this. And that's
Right.
true. And then as time went on, I began seeing the bigger picture and how our culture is enabling us to just forget and pretend that these things didn't happen.
Right.
Yeah.
And in the Black community, and of course, I'm not speaking for all Black people, but in the Black community, with the erasure of certain books that are in libraries and things that can be taught in school and not taught in school, it feels like that is on purpose, because obviously they don't want the history to be told, right? But they don't want the emotional burden that comes with knowing that, I had family that were slave owners. I had family that were colonizers. I had family that did these horrible, egregious things to other humans. And that's the part that they don't want to face.
Absolutely. Yeah. Especially now we see a really concentrated effort to deny that.
Absolutely.
And
Yes.
and it's not doing us any favors. It does not help. In
So,
my
Hillary,
opinion.
when you first found this out, New Year's Eve, you've read this book, what what are your feelings? What are your emotions? Do you have denial, like this can't be true? What are you feeling?
Yes, I automatically believed it was true, and I felt like I had been punched in the stomach. I was devastated because of the relationships I have with indigenous peoples where I live in northern Arizona, I knew about the impacts of genocide and colonization and slavery. And so I was sick. I was just sick and heartbroken and totally distraught. And I had a very hard time sleeping that night. And I just felt like my whole identity was almost being shattered overnight. And when I woke up the next day, I was someone I didn't recognize. I was someone who was no longer in denial and who knew that I had to face this truth head on.
Did you have any anger about, because I'm assuming that no one in your family voluntarily told you this information. I mean, thankfully, the book was handed to you when you started asking those questions, so that we can always be appreciative of that. But did you feel anger that no one was like, Hilary, we need to have this conversation about who our family was?
Yes, I remember that next morning I went to breakfast with my parents and my children. My children were pretty young then. And we sat down and I started talking about it and saying, this book has been at your house. Did you know? And the response from my parents was it was like watching people who were in a fog and, had just been living into some stories and some myths for a long time and had these kind of rote responses to what I was asking. And at first I remember feeling some anger with my own family. But then as time went on too, I realized, oh no, this is our cultural conditioning. This is what all the white families are doing. We've all got these, it's almost like a script that we are taught as children to respond to these realities. And so at that point, I forgave myself for not knowing. I forgave my family for not knowing and for willingly turning a blind eye. And I began this very deep process of unpacking what this meant in myself, and also making a really deep connection that legacy of silence was going to end with me. So my children have grown up knowing this information and helping me work with this information and being beside me the entire time.
How did your children respond to this information?
I think they were, let me see, at the time, I think they were 13 and 8. And so they were, the thing is that when you talk about these things with kids, you can do it in age appropriate ways so that they are not overwhelmed, so that they know there's a distinction between, our people did this and it's not your fault, but also we're responsible to take steps to repair the legacy that has been left to us. So they have always been okay with that. And they've learned how to walk through the world knowing that information. And this whole thing that's happening now with like children can't stand to feel guilt or shame.
Yes.
That is just such, it's
a lie.
Yes. It's a lie. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, because there are ways to communicate this that don't create mental health harm to children.
Yes.
Yeah.
So what advice would you give parents, especially white parents? Because we're not going to say everyone, because I never use absolutes, but the majority of white people in America had their ancestors had some dealings with slavery, had some dealings with colonization, however that looked at the time, and received benefits because of those things. How do white parents and grandparents have this conversation and educate the children, their next generation, on this is who our family used to be, this is what they used to do, but also help them with the emotional part of it? Because I can assume that that would be a very heavy cross to learn that, my family, had slaves, and, my family was colonizers. Like, how do you help them with that? What's the advice you give to white parents?
Yeah, I think one thing is you have to feel it to heal it. You know, that phrase, like
Yes.
we have to feel it. And so my children saw me grieving. They knew that I was crying about it. They knew
Yes.
that I was struggling. And that's a modeling, I think, that is really healthy because they also saw me process that and move through it and come into a path of reparations. And that is ultimately where our healing lies, is in reparations. That
Yes.
is accessible and available to everyone. And then the other thing too is actually educating children about the systemic nature of these things. The fact that our entire economy in the United States was built on the institution of slavery. It is not
Yes.
a thing of the past. And the families who were, accumulating land and wealth and property during that time, in many cases, still have that wealth.
They do.
Not
They
all
still have that
cases,
land. Yes.
right? I mean, not all families. Like my family didn't have any wealth to speak of from this legacy, but in some cases that's true. And so we have to see, talk to kids about how it's not a personal failing. It's a systemic failing. And then work to change the systems. Another thing I think that's really helpful is to build relationships, build family relationships with both Indigenous and African American communities. Because the thing is that as white families, many of us are living in segregation and we don't understand. We literally do not understand anything about the racial wealth gap, anything about the land that was taken. And so it's easy for us to assume that other communities are facing poverty or marginalization because it's their fault. And building relationships totally dispels that understanding. And we start to see people as whole human beings who are still being impacted by all of this oppression.
Exactly. Exactly. And it cannot be, as so many people say, just get over it. It's
No.
not something that you can just get over.
Mm-mm.
So, Hilary, once you read the book and finished the book, did it challenge your thoughts of your identity? Did it challenge your thoughts of who you are?
Big time. Big time. Yes, I came to realize that part of my acculturation into whiteness was this sense of innocence. And this is a big part of whiteness, is the feeling, the sensation that we need to feel like we are good people, right?
Mm.
That we are not culpable, that we are not, we haven't victimized anyone, right? And so once I began seeing that in myself and that desire to be innocent, again, I took what was happening inside of me and started looking out to the bigger picture and realizing, oh, this is part of our national myth and it's all based on the papal bulls that the Vatican issued in the late 1400s, which eventually became Manifest Destiny and the Doctrine of Discovery. And so it's this whole mythology that we are the chosen people, that we had the right to do these things to other communities, that we had the right to steal land and to kidnap people from Africa and force them to come over here and build us an economy. And again, zooming out and looking at that bigger picture helped me heal from the inside out and take it less personally while still maintaining the accountability to reparations and systems change.
And how long do you think it took you to get to that point of being okay talking about it, working through the grieving process, but making it out on the other end and understanding the reparations part of it?
I think it was probably about 3 or 4 years. And one of the things that happened in that time is that I was working with an African-American elder named Yeye Louisa Tish. And she did a divination for me, which is part of her culture and her spiritual practice. And she told me about a book that I had written, which I hadn't written a book at that point. Wow. And she said, the ancestors are saying the book is already written and you need to get out of the way. And wow. Then she's an author. And so I was terrified to write that book. But she helped me get started. She gave me some writing prompts. She gave me a deadline. And she basically very lovingly held my feet over the fire and was like, you're going to write this book. And so it was that process of writing through those years that helped me develop the language and the words and get the clarity in myself to be able to talk about it.
Was there a particular part of the book that your ancestors wrote about your family being colonizers and slave owners that hit you the hardest?
You know, it's funny. One thing that hit me really hard was this I read on the first night. I saw the names of maybe 8 or 9 enslaved people with the dollar amounts that they were being bought and sold for. That was just like, it still gives me the chills. It made me so sick to see that. And then another interesting thing is that as I've gone back and returned to the book over years, I see new things every time. So another thing I saw years later was that my ancestor who first arrived in North Carolina in 1739, 2 years later, he was on record as being part of a meeting. And the purpose of the meeting was to assert the right of settlers to grab land. So the fact that that was documented was just like, so heavy to read. But also those things that are especially hard have eventually become the superpowers for our family to work with. And, you know, addressing the names of those people who were enslaved, there's a story about that in my book where we did a family ritual to ask forgiveness. And that whole process is what really enabled me to move into reparations, is really looking at it head on.
Was there ever a time, Hilary? Was there ever a time that, I mean, you know the old saying, once you know, you can't unknow it. But was there ever a time that you were like, I wish I wouldn't even ask the question. I wish I would have just remained naive to all of this information?
You know, no.
Wow.
Because as hard as it was, it has also been incredibly freeing and liberating for me. And the reason I say that is because, you know, for me, living in that state of amnesia, denial, shame, delusion, all of those things, it almost felt like I was sleepwalking through the first, you know, few decades of my life, because I found this out when I was 40 years old. And it feels like since then, the last decade, I feel awake and I feel much more empowered and stronger. Working through all this material has given me a lot of resilience and a lot of more courage, more a sense of being whole. And so I guess I wouldn't have known it prior to being 40 years old, but there was a piece of me that was definitely missing and severed from walking around with this legacy and not knowing it.
So you feel like, or at least the way I'm hearing it, you feel like by knowing this incredible, hurtful information has made you whole, so to speak?
Yeah.
Really?
Yes, absolutely. Because if you think about it, in some ways, I think it became very clear to me as I went along that there has been such moral injury carried by so many of our families from not looking at this, not talking about this, pretending it didn't happen, trying to deny it, carrying all the booty of the stolen goods off into our own sunset, you know, and that's bad for our humanity. That's not good for us. It's bad for our souls to carry that kind of weight. And in some ways, I think I'm part of all kinds of circles of people that are doing this kind of work now. And what I see across the board is that there's something about those of us who are alive right now in this generation where this material is coming up finally in order to be addressed and in order to be healed in our own families. And I think in previous generations, we did not have the capacity for various reasons. And now we're beginning to develop that capacity, and we've got to keep it going.
Did this information help or hurt conversations with your family, especially around the dinner table during the holidays? Like, how did this information impact those conversations?
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I went through several years of feeling very alone because I would start to talk about what I was writing, what I was thinking about, etc. And, you know, I would have white friends and family get very defensive. And the number one thing that I heard was, that was a long time. You shouldn't feel guilty about that. And I heard that statement so many times. That was a long time ago. You shouldn't feel guilty about it. That I realized, oh my gosh, this is a script that we've all been taught somehow, even though no one ever explicitly taught us that. We all know it. Yes. And I began realizing that this is part of what is keeping a lid on our potential as white identifying people. The idea that we have to stop with feeling guilty about it. It's not about feeling guilty. No one is asking us to feel guilty, but what they are asking us to do is to work with it and move through the guilt and come out the other side. And so I struggled for years because that was the almost guaranteed response. Every time I brought it up, I felt very alone. And that, you know, that was hard for me, but I kept working with it because I was very fortunate to have African-American and Indigenous mentors in my life who told me, you have to keep going, keep going, keep going, keep going. And so I listened to them instead of some of the people who were closest to me and my own friends and family. And it's proved to be very rewarding. And now I feel like that window is opening up more. People are developing more capacity to look at it. And in my own family, those conversations have improved too. And so, yeah, it was an uncomfortable phase, but we worked through it.
Do you think, Hilary, that maybe this is, and I'm sure there's several reasons why white people do not talk about slavery and colonization, but do you think that one of the reasons is because they don't want to have to go through what you went through, being alone, changing the dynamics of their family and friends? Maybe the people stop talking to them, stop inviting them to social gatherings. And even, you know, work, that maybe their work relationships are affected by this information and this knowledge and these conversations as well. And people don't want to change that.
Yeah, so it is definitely true. There's a fear, I think, of being isolated from our families, our communities, etc., and creating awkward situations. It's a huge taboo for us to talk about this stuff culturally. And there's something deeper that I found in myself too, which was a fear about my own identity. Like, if I strip away this myth of innocence and this entitlement and this denial, who will I be? And one of the things that really helped me with that was spending time on the land where I live. And so I live next to a mountain, a sacred mountain. She's a mountain of kinship who is revered by all of the peoples of this region. And I went and sat with her for hours and hours and hours. And it's interesting because a lot of the elders who have taught me and who I work with across cultures, this is what they all say. They all say, in order for our white relatives to move through this very painful material, they have got to learn how to sit with the land. The land is what is going to give us the strength to move through this, which is maybe a little bit counterintuitive, but it totally works.
Good. Well, that's something tangible, that at least people can try. How do you differentiate guilt versus responsibility in this space?
Absolutely. Well, guilt is a very disempowering feeling. It's very can shut you down. It's sticky, and it's definitely part of the process that we have to go through to feel that. But I always really recommend that people just do everything in their power to feel it and let it go, whether that's crying or wailing or pounding pillows or going for a 50-mile hike or whatever. It's like, let it work its way through your body and out, because guilt is not helpful. Ultimately, it's not something that we should stay with. And really the goal for me is to move toward accountability and responsibility. And that looks like, first of all, knowing in your heart that it's true, what happened here, learning the real history of this country, which I've done through some books, which I can share with you for show notes. And then, moving into action, really meaningful action that comes from your own heart, from your own talents, your own assets, whatever they may be. It may be financial in some cases, and it may be more like showing up as a volunteer in other cases, or in service work of some kind. And all of those things are really important to embrace to avoid getting stuck in the trap of guilt.
Were you having racial justice or racial conversations at all within your community, family, friends, work before you learned this information?
I was on the very early side of that learning curve when this started. I was just beginning to realize, looking around, why do we not know any people of color? Why do we only know white people, right? And realizing that we were in a vacuum of racial segregation without ever having intended that, but we were. And so I was just beginning to wake up from those things and to begin taking steps to shift that when this all started.
Yeah. It seems like it all came together at the right time for you.
It did, for sure. Yeah. I'm glad it happened when I was 40, because I had the maturity to look at it,
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Did your knowledge or your feelings, your thoughts about North Carolina and Mississippi, those states, did it change for you? Like what you thought about those states once you found out this information?
Yes. One thing that has been very, very beautiful is that I have been able during these 10 years to build relationships with folks in Mississippi and in North Carolina. And I've been able to go to both places and engage with those communities and be part of rituals and ceremonies and, organizing in those spaces and returning resources to those communities so that they can do work to build up the community. And that has just been one of the most fulfilling things about this, because prior to this knowledge, I had never even been to Mississippi or North Carolina.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And all of a sudden, I'm able to come back as a descendant of this legacy and actually be welcomed by people. Like that just blows my mind.
Yes.
The level of grace that has been shown to me is unbelievable. It's so humbling. And it's just, I don't think I could have done it if it hadn't been for that that grace, that forgiveness, that kindness that was shown by communities that my own ancestors extracted from, you know?
Mm-hmm. Hilary, how do you avoid making this all about you and putting yourself in the center while still being honest about your experience and being honest about the emotions that you felt?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, along the way, as I was writing, I worked with an editor who, you know, she read a manuscript, one of the many drafts, and she's like, this is way too long. And then she said, the parts of this book that are not working are the parts where you're up on your soapbox and lecturing. Okay. And so I said, well, I'm afraid to make it all about me. And she said, no, those are the parts of the book that are working, where you're actually telling your own story and using the word I to speak about your own experience. And I said, well, won't that make it all about me? And she said, no, that's what people connect with through their heart. And so through that process of editing, I learned that storytelling is really important. I think a lot of times, you know, people get turned off from racial justice conversations because when they're focused on analysis and on, you know, intellectual thought and on making people wrong or right, that's a dynamic that's not very engaging, and that can be very shaming and very repellent, you know. And so even though it's kind of paradoxical, telling my story is where I always go back to after all the editors I worked with, because I've learned that there's a strength in that connects people empathetically and helps them find their own parts of their story that mirror mine and build their own narrative about it.
Did you have any unexpected moments of clarity, unexpected moments of growth, or just unexpected moments as you are going through this process? It's been, you know, almost 10 years at this point.
Yes, actually, one of the most unexpected was when I began working with an Oglala Lakota elder. His name is Basil Braveheart, and he is 92. He lives on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota. And when Basil and I first met in 2018, I began speaking with him about this. And I said, I don't understand why Indigenous communities have been so kind to me. Why are they so accepting? And he said, you need to focus on forgiving yourself and forgiving your ancestors. And he told me a story about being a little child. He grew up 20 miles from the Wounded Knee massacre site. Wow. And when he was 5 years old, his grandmother, who didn't speak any English and had never been to church, taught him, you need to forgive the people who committed that massacre and forgive their grandparents. And so that was hugely shocking to me, the idea that I would forgive enslavers and forgive colonizers in my lines. But as I worked with Basil over years of time and I began practicing that, it was a huge surprise to me that was the key that unlocked the door to moving into making reparations. Right. Again, it's kind of a paradox, but it surprisingly worked. And it gave me a sense of unleashing a bunch of energy that had been boxed up and trapped in guilt and shame and things like that, and flowing that newly released energy toward repair.
How are you able to sit in the discomfort, sit in the sadness, sit in the grieving of knowing that you had ancestors that were colonizers as well as slave owners, and not try and rush to resolve it? Just sit there and feel that emotion, which I feel like not just white people, I feel like all people, whatever race you are, no one wants to sit in that discomfort. No one wants to sit in the grief.
Yeah, that's really true. Yeah, I mean, for me, the most helpful things have been learning to ritualize it and ritually, feel it, open up to it, allow myself to cry, allow it to move through my body, and then ritually let it go. And that's not something that's a one and done. I've had to do it many times. Um, but, I do feel like my ancestors have definitely tapped me on the shoulder in this lifetime. There is no way I would be doing this if it weren't for them. And so I also feel like, working with my ancestors who were, good people, really humble people, people with good values, and people who were, just raising their families and doing their best. Working with those kinds of ancestors helps me get the strength and the perseverance to sit with that discomfort. And also over time, I've learned, I mean, I still feel uncomfortable all the time, when I go into spaces that are the spaces belonging to communities of color, I'm always uncomfortable. And I have to like check myself and go, it's okay, because this is the medicine that I need to undo my white conditioning. I need to sit here and be quiet, and I need to just feel what I feel, and I'm going to work through it, and it'll be fine.
Yes. What advice would you give other people that are afraid to ask the questions like you did, that are afraid to investigate their history? And I'm specifically talking about white people that are afraid to find out what their ancestors were doing and how they were doing it. What advice would you give them to, I guess, nudge them to go ahead and investigate, find out?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would say there's gold on the other side. You may walk through some, muddy trenches and like mosquito infested swamps.
Yes.
but you will come out on the other side with a fuller sense of your capacity as a fully expressed human being. And you will come out with a feeling of wholeness and belonging. This is the thing about whiteness, is that it's built upon a very tentative sense of belonging. It's a sense of belonging that we achieved by oppressing other people, by taking land, and by extracting resources from the earth. And that's not real belonging.
Right.
When you have all the power and you're holding all the money and resources at the top of the pyramid, that's not real belonging. And I really believe that that's what a lot of us are deeply seeking, is a sense of belonging. And it's going to come through actually unpacking what happened here, our people's role in it, and learning to behave differently.
How can descendants of colonizers engage in this conversation, engage in their history without getting defensive, without getting angry that people are talking about it?
Yeah, I think it's normal to feel rage as part of this conversation because we were deceived. We were brought up in a culture that deceived us and taught us that, we were good, upstanding citizens, taught us to recite the Pledge of Allegiance and
Yes.
all of these myths about liberty and justice for all, and it's normal to feel rage, but within a mixed group, a mixed race group is not the place to express that rage. The place to express that rage is, with your therapist or with your good white friend, or going out and hitting the ground with some sticks, or gardening, or, you name it, drumming or dancing. Those are the places to release that rage, not on people of color. And I think one thing I've learned along the way is that we need white caucus spaces in order to process and release these things together. Because when we do it in front of people of color, it's incredibly traumatizing for them. and it causes a lot of emotional labor that they do not need to do for us. We need to do that for each other. And that's really important.
Do you think, Hilary, that there are still conversations about slavery, around slavery, that does not need to be had?
Like, what's an example?
I don't really have I don't have an example, but I'm thinking, and I wrote the question down, that are there conversations that people don't need to talk about when it comes to slavery? Or every conversation, even the hard ones, even the hanging, the rape, does all of those conversations need to be had?
I think they all need to be had. And honestly, too, I have been to 2 plantation museums. One is the Whitney Plantation Museum in Louisiana, and one is Staggville in North Carolina. And it has been so valuable going on those tours, because I know for me, I need to see these little shacks where people were forced to live. I need to see the conditions under which they were living. I need to see the fields where they were forced to work their lives away. I need to see the chains, the shackles. I need to see those things. I need to see the names written on the wall, the memorials. I need to read the stories about how, both women and men were brutally exploited and bred like animals. I mean, I need to see that. And it's painful, but for me, this requires a certain level of vigilance, because everything in white culture is trying to keep us asleep. And so every time I engage with this material or read a book or a story or listen to a podcast, it's like, oh, that's right. That's right. This is why we have to keep fighting and we have to stay awake,
Do you think this journey that started almost 10 years ago to the date that we are recording this podcast, do you think this journey will ever be complete for you?
No. And actually, that is why in the title of my book is the word becoming, because it is a constant process of becoming. And the work is never going to be done for me. And what I am really committed to, though, is like staying with it for the long haul, knowing that it's really hard. It's painful sometimes. Sometimes I have to step away and take a break, but then I always come back to it, because it's taken many centuries to build all of the inequity that we are seeing right now. And it's going to take many generations to undo it. And so I just see myself as the first of hopefully many generations who will be working on this together and creating a more equitable society long term.
Hilary, as we get ready to wrap up this conversation, what is your intention in this space of talking about your ancestors being colonizers, your ancestors being slave owners, talking about the difficulty, that you have experienced and still experience with this knowledge, and then moving through the world in a different way now? What is your intention in talking about it and teaching it?
Yeah. I think my intention is to hopefully connect with other people who are on the cusp and who are standing on that threshold and wondering, can I do this? And so my hope is that the power of storytelling and vulnerability can encourage others to say, yes, you can. And you will be stronger and better for it in the long term. Your family will be stronger and better for it over time. And so it's, this movement is not going to come from a top-down type of situation. I mean, look at who's at the top right now.
Yeah.
It's going to come from the grassroots, and it spreads like mycelial networks, and I'm already where I'm situated. able to glimpse all kinds of networks who are doing this kind of work and finding each other and connecting. And it gives me a lot of hope. So I'm hoping to build and encourage that network to grow.
Mm-hmm. You know, that was going to be my last question, but I have one more. Speaking of our president, do you think, because I feel like in the Black community, a lot of people look to the government, a lot of people look to the president, whatever president that is. You know, I
Right.
know President Barack Obama being the first Black president, you know, got a lot of pushback because the Black community felt like he wasn't doing enough for reparations and in the Black community. And the same thing, you know, went with President Biden. The same thing is happening with President Trump. Do you think the issue will be, I'm not going to say solved, I don't know if that will ever happen, but the issue will be reflected and begin the work at the top? Or do you feel like it needs to start in our families? It needs to start at the grassroots level if we want some kind of change, some kind of reparation?
Yes, I absolutely think it starts in the family and our own communities.
Mm-hmm.
Because, I mean, look how dysfunctional our systems are. We can't get anything done. And especially when you bring in the word reparations at any kind of government level, it almost immediately shuts everything down. Like it's just the ultimate stalemate, you know? And so that's why I kind of switched gears into working on a personal reparations plan. And I will share a Google Doc with you to share with anyone for show notes, because literally anyone who has the time and capacity to listen to this podcast probably also has the capacity to make a personal reparations plan. And so there's something incredibly empowering about that, because it's all about beginning where we are and starting with our own power. And instead of trying to like reach to some external power source to fix it for us, it's really about coming from within.
Hilary, I seriously cannot thank you enough for coming on my podcast and having an uncomfortable conversation and speaking uncomfortable truth. So thank you so much.
Thank you too, Crystal. And I'm really grateful for you bringing this topic forward, because, you know, we need it. So I appreciate you. Thank you.
Thank you. To my community, thank you so much for tuning in and watching. You can get Hilary's podcast on YouTube Podcast and Apple Podcasts. And remember, you always have time to listen and learn on the go.